This video is made possible by Morning Brew. Morning Brew is an email newsletter sent out every weekday morning. You'll wake up with the most relevant, curated, and informative business news from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, delivered right to your inbox. Morning Brew cuts through the clutter of business news, providing a quick and high-quality daily email newsletter. If you like what we do here at VisualPolitik for politics, you'll love what Morning Brew do for business. I've been subscribed for a few months, and the short piece that arrives in my email inbox every day is genuinely interesting. That is not an easy feat, but Morning Brew absolutely nail it. Like I say, whether you want to learn about startup news from Silicon Valley or investment news from Wall Street, Morning Brew has you covered. And it's quick and easy to read with a cup of coffee in the morning or maybe on your commute. Whatever you like. Click the link in the description below to sign up to Morning Brew and get the most informative and witty business newsletter around. And let's get into it. The end of 2018 couldn't have been more stressful. The protests of the so-called Yellow Vests have unleashed a wave of violence and political rebellion in Emmanuel Macron's France. Increasing fuel taxes to reduce its consumption and also to increase income has infuriated a large part of French society. So, to reject this measure and to take advantage and ask for more changes, hundreds of thousands of people mobilized and took to the streets wearing yellow vests. I think we all know what came next. Thousands of arrests, hundreds of wounded, and a government held against the ropes, forced to take a step back.
Aucune colère ne justifie qu'on s'attaque à un policier, à un gendarme, qu'on dégrade un commerce ou des bâtiments publics.
But just a second, because in this video, we're actually going to talk about China and not France.
China now, China.
And why the hell are you talking about yellow vests, Simon? What's going on?
I don't know.
Well, no, I haven't lost my mind. France's incident may have led to a more violent result than expected, but it isn't an unusual one. When a society doesn't feel represented by its politicians or believes that their rights as citizens are being violated, protests and demonstrations are commonplace. However, this doesn't happen in China, which leads to a few important questions. Why do we never see protests like this in China? Don't the Chinese have more than enough reasons to feel dissatisfied? And perhaps the key question here, how does the Chinese government manage to keep 1.3 billion people under control without any sign of discontent? Alright, so right now some of you are probably thinking, well, yes, Simon, it's a dictatorship. What did you expect? And yes, you are right, but that doesn't tell the whole story. As you know, there's always more to it. So listen up.
The Chinese NonChange.
Despite the reforms which we've already spoken here on VisualPolitik about 20 or 30 years ago, it was expected that today's China would be really different. Many experts predicted that as the Chinese economy began to prosper and its middle class grow, within a short time social demands would cause a change in the political system towards a more open, free, and less corrupt system. Since then, the country has experienced an impressive economic takeoff, and the Chinese middle class is now composed of hundreds of millions of people. But there's still no trace of riots. Okay, now yes, there have been protests, but there's no real comparison here. And for many Chinese people, seeing a demonstration is kind of like seeing the beer Carling. You know it exists, but you don't really want to get involved with it. And not only that, but with Xi Jinping in power, the exact opposite is happening. While Chinese society is experiencing its best moment in history in economic terms, Xi Jinping is the most powerful president since Mao. In fact, he won't even respect the 2-mandate limitation that Chinese leaders had to adhere to. Yep, another case like that of Evo Morales in Bolivia. But But let's go back to the question at hand. Why does the Chinese government have so much control over everything that happens? And why hasn't this control suffered any erosion despite the fact that now the country is much richer and much more open to the world? And also, well, what can we expect in the future? Well, folks, there are 3 key questions that we're going to answer in this video. And yes, we're going to talk about the repression machine later, but we can also find some additional elements here. So check it out.
The Pact.
A recent New York Times article talked about how the Chinese government has managed to turn their economic development into a way to legitimize the regime. And that has a lot to do with the kind of tacit pact that exists between the Chinese government and a good portion of Chinese society. It's an agreement based on the following. The government promises to do what it can to achieve better living conditions, and in return, society, or at least a good part of it, doesn't question the government itself and looks the other way on some political issues. So here's a question, and it's controversial, but it's really topical. Would you be willing to renounce civil liberties and political participation in exchange for an improvement in your standard of living? Well, you can leave your answer to that in the comments below, and also in this survey. But don't worry, the video is not ending just yet. Now, this is all very easy to say, but it's not easy to carry out. So the question we can ask ourselves now is, how has the Chinese government managed to fulfill its part of this bargain? Well, we've already talked about one of the issues on VisualPolitik. It's in a video we made about the reforms in the country that were carried out after Mao's death. To create wealth, the Chinese government put aside economic Marxism and freed the forces of private enterprise, competition, globalism, and capitalism. Now, we've already told you this, but that's not all. The other element that the government has used has been none other than education. And it's not only just because they control the content, which we all know. See, to make everyone feel like they had a chance, especially the almost 40% of the rural population that's still mostly poor, and this amounts to more than 500 million people in the part of China that doesn't have Shanghai skyscrapers, the Chinese government has created a social narrative by which anyone who strives, regardless of their economic level, can climb the ladder of social mobility and reach the highest echelons. So, how did the government do that? Well, they did it through universities and an access system known as Gaokao. The Gaokao is a very hard test that if you pass, it guarantees you the opportunity to study at a higher education institution, regardless of your income level and your family's situation. Because in China, unless you have money, access isn't universal, indeed, it's far from it. Each year, 9 million young people compete for only tens of thousands of places. And most young people know that university, it can change their life. You can already imagine the incredible amount of competition that exists to just pass this one exam. But in a country where corruption in institutions is usually part of the game, Gaokao is seen as an opportunity, a relatively fair test that any student can access. That way, the narrative that the Chinese government has built for years is that in this country there's full social mobility, and any young person, regardless of their family's income level, can progress up the social scale. And on the flip side of that, there's obviously, if they don't achieve that progress, it's all on them.
Gaokao allows the government to say, if you are not successful, you can only blame yourself. You did not work hard enough. That is a very powerful way of governing. Yong Zhao, an education professor at the University of Kansas.
Actually, it really isn't like that. The Gaokao is a system that favors some skills over others, and therefore some students over other students. But the Chinese government has managed to introduce this interpretation of equality into their society. That's how the Chinese government has kept Chinese society relatively satisfied over the past few years. The Chinese have seen how their lives improve year after year, and thanks to the Gaokao and a university system that allows for social mobility, everyone feels like opportunities are available to everyone. In addition, the Gaokao favors a study model based on memory and repetition, and not on creativity and critical analysis, but that's something we can talk about another time. But that's not all, so let's continue.
prime perspective.
The second question that might explain why the country's economic growth hasn't been accompanied by political demands has a lot to do with the speed of the changes. Allow me to explain. Social and cultural changes often happen much more slowly than economic and technological changes. Yes, China has experienced a huge amount of development, but not enough time has passed for political demands to emerge. This isn't strange. If we take a look at the history of Western democracies, both in Europe and even in America, we can see that political changes have always been much slower than economic changes, although they did eventually arrive. But we can't forget that countries such as Spain, Portugal, Taiwan, South Korea, and the nations of Eastern Europe, among many others, suffered under dictatorships of all kinds until only just a few decades ago. In other words, the Chinese are still moving from poverty to a more comfortable lifestyle. But yes, it's obvious that we can't talk about the Chinese government's control over its citizens without discussing coercion, so listen up.
The power of the Force.
I think none of us will be surprised if I say that the Chinese government has more than enough tools to subdue protests. In the end, China is still a dictatorship that leads in rankings like these.
China named world's top executioner as global rate falls. Amnesty says more people executed in China than rest of world combined. China is the world's biggest prison for journalists.
Folks, the Chinese government's control is so great that, as you all know, they've basically been able to create their own internet. In China, this network is so censored that services like Google, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as millions of web pages, are simply blocked. Except for the use of VPN networks, which are of course illegal, the Chinese only see the information that the Chinese government allows them to see. And there's more. It seems that by 2020, the Chinese government wants to implement a kind of ranking that will classify each and every Chinese citizen based on a lot of variables: credit, financial, social, political, legal, etc., etc. That is, the Chinese government wants to create a ranking of good and bad citizens. Maybe you've seen the television show Black Mirror.
Black Mirror is almost a reality. China says it's on track to launch its dystopian scorecard system that ranks citizens on every aspect of their behavior by 2020.
Obviously, political issues will carry a great deal of weight, so being critical of the Beijing government could place you among the most unreliable citizens, which would close many doors to you, both personal and professional, which is kinda terrifying. And now you can see the tools that the Chinese government employs to maintain its control over society. First, the political pact and the promise of prosperity and opportunity for all. Second, the fact that social change moves more slowly than economic change. And third, the huge amount of control and repression that the Chinese government uses. These are all reasons why there are no yellow vests in China. But the question we can all ask ourselves is, will the Chinese government perpetuate its model, or is this country going to suffer a wave of democratic change and openness? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of our Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting us in our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.